Everyone, I'm Anna Rose. I'm the Exhibitions and Programming Associate at the Wende. Thanks so much for joining us today for the 20th talk in our Cold War Spaces series. Today we're welcoming Daniel Pick on the topic of psychic space, brainwashing in the Cold War. Daniel is a psychoanalyst and professor of history at Birkbeck, University of London. The books he has written include War Machine, The Rationalization of Slaughter in the Modern Age, The Pursuit of the Nazi Mind, Hitler, Hess, and the Analysts, Psychoanalysis, a very short introduction, and as co-editor of Psychoanalysis in the Age of Totalitarianism. He leads the research project Hidden Persuaders, Brainwashing, Culture, Clinical Knowledge, and the Cold War Human Sciences, circa 1950 to 1990, which explores the history of the human sciences and the professions during the Cold War. He also advised on our 2018 to 2019 exhibition War of Nerds, Psychological Landscapes of the Cold War. Today's program will be about a 30-minute conversation between Daniel and Joes Segal, the Wende's Chief Curator and Director of Programming. After that, we'll leave about 15 minutes for Q&A, so please get your questions ready to put in the Q&A box during that time. As always, we appreciate everyone's questions, but please keep them short and no longer than a sentence or two. For comments or any discussion, we have the chat box open. And please remember there's a blue box that says "to," and please change that to all panelists and attendees, because otherwise it just goes to the panelists. And as we're getting started, feel free to say hi in the chat. It's always really nice to see where people are joining in from. And afterwards, I'll be sending some links in a follow-up email in case you want to learn more about these topics. Additionally, this week's Friday night film selection will also relate to today's talk, and it'll be a double feature of two documentaries produced by Hidden Persuaders about the origins of the idea of brainwashing. And lastly, I'd also like to thank Susan Horwitz and Rick Feldman for generously supporting discussion series at the Wende and our virtual programs. And I'll hand it off to you to get started.
Thank you, Anna Rose. Many dystopian novels and sci-fi movies have addressed the idea of mind control. How easy would it be for authoritarian states not to worry about protests, demonstrations, and political opponents, simply by reprogramming critical minds into support of a supreme leader, a great helmsman, or a stable genius? Soviet show trials, Chinese re-education camps, and secret mind control experiments from the CIA, such as MK-Ultra, attest to the fact that governments and secret services dream of infiltrating people's minds. Today we will speak about the Cold War history of brainwashing and discuss how current phenomena, such as fake news and conspiracy theories, can take possession of people's thoughts and beliefs. Daniel, I've been very much looking forward to this conversation. Welcome to Cold War Spaces.
Thanks very much for inviting me.
It's a pleasure. And
let's go on a conversation that we began in person at the Wende about 18 months ago.
Absolutely, yeah. So let's start with a basic question. What is brainwashing and where does the term come from?
Well, brainwashing, we all use the term, it's entered into the language, a coercive takeover of the mind, a set of techniques to influence, reshape, to break minds and remake minds. And there's a back history, I guess, before the word was coined. In the 19th century, the fear of forms of total possession through magnetism, animal magnetism, or then hypnotism. And so there's that back history of fear about the nefarious uses of various kinds of technique that could have a therapeutic benefit, but could also be used to control people. And that played into theories of group psychology and theories about mass suggestion and so on, in the previous century. But in the 20th century, really the story of brainwashing, formally speaking, begins post-Second World War, when the term itself is coined. It comes up almost simultaneously in the Guardian newspaper in Britain and in the Miami News in the US, most famously there, where a journalist who had a connection to the CIA, Edward Hunter, offered the term as a translation of a Chinese term for mind cleansing. So he offers this as though, in a way, he's just translating, and talking about a technique that is being used in communist China. He warns. So he warns about it. Other articles appear. Hunter goes on to produce books. But the idea initially is of this science of mind control that would use a panoply of techniques to possess prisoners' minds, but ultimately a whole kind of, as it were, population that might be in an enclosed state and could be re-educated or brainwashed.
Yeah, so the origin of the term is related to the Korean War, right?
That's right. I mean, that's where, so it comes just at the beginning with Hunter, just after the Chinese Revolution. And I mean, it's also backshadowed by George Orwell. Let's not forget 1984, which is just, just at the end of the 40s, that offers a kind of vision of brainwashing, even though it doesn't yet have this term. But it's the Korean War where this really becomes a huge public issue with prisoners of war and the question of the re-education of prisoners of war. So that's where, and a series of mysterious confessions that emerge in the Korean War, particularly shot down US pilots, who people who start confessing to germ warfare. So there's that story going on in sort of around 1951, 52. And then at the end of the Korean War in 1953, this really becomes a very hot topic when a group of American POWs, 23 initially, and then they becomes 21 because 2 of them changed their minds, but 21 American GIs who apparently of their own free will choose to move to China, to live in Chairman Mao's China, having been released from North Korean captivity. And that's where this issue kind of really becomes very explosive. The idea is they must have been brainwashed in order to be persuaded to, as it were, not return to the, quote, land of the free, but to go and live in a quote, totalitarian society.
Right. And speaking about totalitarian societies, there is this 1961 book by Robert J. Lifton, Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism. Can you briefly explain what role that book has played in the thinking about brainwashing?
Yes, and I think one should pay homage really to Robert J. Lifton. He's still alive, he's in his 90s, he's still active. I had an email from him only this week, actually. He's still a very active writer and political thinker, activist, who's writing about the contemporary crisis of politics and climate change. But he's really a key figure in this story, and I think the most important single writer on the, on this whole topic of Cold War brainwashing. He was, I mean, for him the story goes back earlier. He was a psychiatrist at the end of the Korean War, and he was involved in going back on a ship, one of the troop carriers to the US from Asia, with soldiers who'd been held captive, and he's researching prisoner psychology in the 50s, and he's also doing research on people who've been held prisoners of conscience from China. So there's a kind of whole body of work he developed in the 1950s, which then leads to this very important book in 1961 that you mentioned on thought reform. And I think he's the most balanced of those early analysts of brainwashing, because he's neither just dismissing it as sort of fake news, that it's an invented hysterical fantasy, that there's nothing, as it were, real about brainwashing, but nor is he going along with some of the more sort of spectacular and melodramatic claims of Hunter and some of the others who write these sort of rather florid accounts. And he tries to really think about the conditions in which that are most conducive to coercive persuasion and to sort of breaking people down really and remaking them. And he develops a whole set of criteria about the conditions of the control of the milieu, forms of sacred science, purification, confession, the power of life and death. So he offers a number of sort of concepts that are useful in the book, and a series of very disturbing, powerful case studies of particular men and women who've been held prisoner and who have converted to, as it were, the enemy cause, or even to the psychology of their captors in jail. So he writes about that, and he's thinking primarily of China, but he's not just interested in in China. He's interested also in the Soviet Union, but also in more subtle forms of mind control in Western societies too.
That's interesting because he mentions the term totalism in his title, which I would associate with totalitarianism. But then, of course, there were also developments going on in the West, and I mentioned the CIA secret research project MK Ultra. Can you tell us a little bit what that was, MK Ultra,
I tell you what,
and how
just
it works?
before we get to MK Ultra, I think you mentioned totalism as an idea.
Right.
And given that the topic tonight is psychic space,
Right.
I think it's very important to understand what he really develops that together with a psychoanalyst, emigre psychoanalyst, Erik Erikson, who was an important writer also on Nazism and on mass psychology and also psychobiography. And they worked together initially. And I think it's an important concept that is, as you say, linked to totalitarianism. But by totalism, they're really trying to envision a kind of condition of the mind that is analogous to a kind of one-party state, where there is no pluralism, no tolerance, no flexibility, no room for doubt, for rethinking, for contradiction. So a kind of absolute singularized system of belief that will brook no contradiction. And that's, and that's a state of mind that is induced, as it were, in various forms of conversion ritual in cults or in totalitarian societies. And I think it's important to situate that work in relation to the whole idea of totalitarianism that we've got Orwell we've mentioned, but Hannah Arendt in her book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, develops. And they're thinking about the open mind and the open society as opposed to the closed mind or the totalized mind and the totalitarian society. And that becomes really a kind of leitmotif that runs through so much 1950s political philosophy. And then that takes us, I guess, to MK Ultra, the fear that, that emerges, which is also in a way exploited or capitalized on in Western intelligence, that China and the Soviet Union have these new techniques, a kind of mixture of solitary confinement, group pressure and sort of guilt tripping people, coercive storytelling, repetitive, demanding narratives where you have to get the story right of your life in re-education, ideas about various new forms of drugs, sensory deprivation, stress positions. There's a whole kind of literature that emerges about what the other side, on the other side of the iron and bamboo curtains, are doing, that is used to justify, as a kind of countermeasure, secret programs of research in the 50s, beginning, MK Ultra and various other esoteric code words, but that's the most important, this project that begins in 53, that licenses all kinds of academic researchers, clinicians, explorers of the mind to work for the CIA, to develop these kind of countermeasures or techniques of interrogation that use the human sciences in these programmatic ways, sort of the kinds of mental torture, as it were, that may not leave marks on the body or at least on the face, so that at a trial you can't see the torture, but basically breaking people. And they develop these programs, and there are notorious programs also in mental hospitals, including in Canada, where people are secretly funded. Case of Ewan Cameron is perhaps the most notorious at McGill University, technique called psychic driving that he develops, but others, John Lilly, who works on sensory deprivation. So basically the MK Ultra is the name for this array of programs of research that are eventually exposed and become well known, and that become in a way the counter techniques also of resistance that the CIA want to develop, so that if Western, special forces or troops or spies are held, that they might, the hope is they'd have greater resilience to resist. So that's kind of the context of the Cold War battle for the mind.
Right, so it's mental torture in defense of a free society, so to speak.
Yes, that's the claim. I mean, that the ends justify the means, and that we see in a way where this really, that there's all this is going on in the 50s, onwards, and various things eventually get exposed. But I guess our contemporary interest in it kind of re-emerges after 9/11 and the so-called war on terror that the Bush administration initiates, where we end up with other euphemisms, enhanced interrogation, and then the controversies around the techniques of interrogation that are developed, that are informed by a body of research that goes back to the 50s. And one should
link between Guantanamo Bay and the stories you were.
Yeah, and much is now written on that. You know, I mean, there's Jane Mayer, the American journalist Jane Mayer, has written on the dark side of all of that. And there are many other books, you know, about the war on terror and these techniques. One should also say that there's the original concern in the 50s about what you know, Mao's China and Stalin's Russia are doing. There's then a further spate of reports in the 1970s about new techniques on the Soviet side to use psychology. And I mean, part of it is back to Pavlov and conditioning and behavioral conditioning, which is also a kind of key ingredient of this. But by the 1970s, there's also new concerns about exploration of the paranormal and telepathy and mind reading. It's the kind of age of Uri Geller and sort of the sensation of kind of metal bending and you know, all sorts of new, sort of more fantastical and paranormal experiments of that era. Yeah. The esoteric that lead, and if people are interested, there's a CIA report in 1975 about this Soviet and Czech research, and I'm indebted here to my colleague at Birkbeck, Dr. Sarah Marks, who worked on the Hidden Persuaders project and now is a colleague at Birkbeck who specializes on the Czech and Soviet literature on all of this. But you know, it leads to a whole other sort of, as it were, moral panic about their advanced research and what needs to be done in the West to counter it.
Right, and actually in the late 1980s, a few television parapsychologists such as Alan Schumacher and Anatoly Kashpirovsky were quite popular. Do you have an explanation for why in this particular historical period they were so successful?
Well, I think that it's interesting that it's towards the end of the century. I mean, that new interest in the kind of, you know, the supernatural and the paranormal, the kind of, you know, the sort of Shakespearean, you know, as in Hamlet, there are more mysteries than in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in our philosophy. But the idea of something kind of at the limits of what's known, that interestingly actually is a century on from all that late 19th century fascination with psychical research. It was in the late 19th century in Cambridge, in England, and then also in the US, that you get this academics researching these sort of, you know, the mysteries of at the edge of science. And a lot of that research is very interesting. It goes back actually earlier in the Soviet period, I mean, where there had been interest in telepathy much earlier that was kind of frowned on by Stalin because it was at odds with a materialist psychology that he wanted, but it kind of bubbled away a bit underground, and then it gets reinvented later. But there's even the idea that human beings through language have lost touch with a more fundamental animal kind of instinctual communication system between, you know, that could be kind of across space that links us all together telepathically. And this gets revived. And then the dark side of that is the idea it could be used to manipulate people in kind of propaganda.
Right, right. So in the research team you were joining, Hidden Persuaders, you are not only looking at these political forms of mind control, but also into commercial indoctrination. Can you tell us a little bit about that side of the research and what role it played during the Cold War?
I mean, I should say, if people listening are interested, you know, do look at the project. It's a team project, and we look at the sort of more Cold War side of, you know, the Soviet side, but also at Western fears about Western advertising is a key area. I mean, the idea that advertising is a form of hidden persuasion. So that's we used actually the title of a famous book by Vance Packard in 1957 called The Hidden Persuaders, where he turns the focus on Western commercial manipulation through Madison Avenue, and the idea that there are new techniques in psychology, a kind of new form of research into the sort of depth psychology, comes to be known as motivational research, pioneered by emigre figures, including, I mean, earlier there's Freud's nephew, Edward Bernays, that people may know, who's important, but Dichter is the key kind of emigre figure. He comes to the US in the 30s and sets up an institute for motivational research that he sells to the advertising industry, really to try to understand people's unconscious wishes and fears, and to craft advertising messages and campaigns that will play into people's unconscious desires and anxieties. And Packard then becomes famous and writes this best-selling book that tries to expose these techniques, including there's a fear of subliminal advertising, images and messages that go so fast you cannot consciously register this. And I think it is important. I mean, just the bigger picture here is that we've got the one focus is Cold War, free world, totalitarian world that's set up. The other is much more this turning the spotlight onto Western society and group psychology. I mean, there's the hidden persuaders. There's the idea of groupthink, which I'm interested in too, which was another key term coined in 1952 by an American business journalist, William H. White, that he then develops. He writes it originally in a business magazine, and then he develops it in a famous book called The Organization Man in 1956, suggesting there's a kind of psychology of conformism that is taking over through big business and corporate capitalism that ultimately threatens capitalism, because it might lead to a kind of compliant, homogenous society of yes men and women who all think the same way. Right. And you get it in popular songs like Little Boxes in 1963, sung by Pete Seeger, where everyone is being churned out by the universities, to think as all the same way as business executives, and in this kind of terrifying new form of conformity.
So did people who were looking into commercial indoctrination, so to speak, what was happening in the field of political brainwashing and mental control, and the other way around? Were there contacts between the two groups?
Yes, I mean, so there's the one focus is commerce and capitalism and corporate culture and big business. The other is really a precursor to the contemporary concerns we now, absolutely legitimately have about data manipulation and Cambridge Analytica and what's happened with Facebook and that we give away data now on a scale that Cold War spying agencies could only have dreamt of course, all of us who use smartphones and tablets and computers. And that concern with artificial intelligence and its use in political manipulation also runs back to that period. And people may be interested, actually, Jill Lepore, the American historian, has written an excellent recent piece in the New Yorker about the corporation created in 1959 called Simulmatics, that provides artificial intelligence data, actually originally to the Kennedy campaign in 1960, and which offers to sort of do modeling of sort of demographic modeling and voting modeling to try to then craft messages more skillfully that will play into key constituencies in the kind of swing states. Right. So that story of now and our anxiety about what's going on now, 2016 and 2020 also has this prehistory. And Packard is very worried about privacy and invasion. So he writes, another book he writes is called The Naked Society in the early 60s, that is about the loss of privacy and the surveillance society.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about our current moment. It seems that there is a strong tendency now of people collectively deceiving themselves. Look at all the discussions about fake news, the wild QAnon conspiracy theories, etc. What can a psychoanalyst like you tell us about self-inflicted brainwashing?
Well, I think I mean, I am interested in this also as a psychoanalyst. I mean, both in my own experience, that there's always, I think, you know, it's kind of very understandable that patients also want to explore how free their analysts are to think for themselves, having had a training, and we need a training in order to do rigorous work as clinicians, as psychoanalysts, and there's a history of the development of training. But of course, patients also want to know that analysts, having had a training, are not just, as it were, apparatchiks or clones or simply following a line, but are able to think for themselves. So one concern patients have might be about analysts who are, can analysts think freely and independently, as well as rigorously within boundaries. Mm-hmm. Patients may also be anxious they will brainwash their analysts and be too powerful themselves. So the whole issue of what Freud calls the transference and the countertransference, the unconscious influences and transmissions and projections, you know, is part of the field. And all the way from Freud onwards, there's a literature on the more ordinary neurotic concerns with freedom to think, whilst also, of course, patients sometimes might say, but I want you to tell me what, you know, I don't want you to just leave it all to me. I would like guidance. So there's that. But there's also a literature on the more psychotic forms, the paranoid, you know, psychotic versions of fear of what came to be called the influencing machine. Mm-hmm. And that I refer there to a paper in 1919 by Freud's follower Victor Tausk about schizophrenic patients who he observed often felt they were at the mercy of some kind of external machine that completely and utterly controlled their thoughts. And it was a psychotic version of perhaps a more ordinary anxiety we may all have about how much am I being persuaded and nudged and influenced by forces outside myself that persuade me. So I'm interested in it clinically, I'm interested in it historically, you know, as a kind of anxiety about clinical knowledge and its uses and misuses, and about these other kind of cultural and political and commercial forms of hidden persuasion.
And why do you think that these phenomena are so big nowadays? What happened to our society?
Well, I mean, we've got a crisis of democracy. We've got a crisis of capitalism too. We've got I mean, obviously, we've had the end of the Cold War. We had that triumphalist period in the 1990s. We also had the rise of the internet that also, of course, plays into conspiracy theories, that the internet is a great source of information, but it's also a way for people with extremely suspicious and anxious, you know, even, of course, paranoid imaginations to group together and find alliances globally, so that it's very easy to not just join the dots yourself and add all these breadcrumbs and dots and come up with often fantastical conspiracy theories, but to make alliances now very easily. But it's a period also of a crisis of a model of a, you know, in a way of a political fantasy around neoliberalism that went into crisis in 2008. So there are kind of, you know, we could look at different moments in the last 20 years of 2001 and that crisis and of what happened in 2001. We could look at 2008 and the financial crisis, and then we could look at the age of COVID, and we could look at all of this story of the last 20 years being played out through the internet, you know, in an age of also huge instability and uncertainty, where one of the things that conspiracy theory can offer is a kind of certainty that, you know, that if you join all these dots, there is at least a kind of clarity of model, of a kind of meta explanation of everything, that it's all joined up. And that can be very tempting. Now, just as it was earlier in the 20th century, if you look at the history of conspiracy theories of global Jewish conspiracy and Nazi ideology, you know, going all the way back really to the late 19th century and early 20th century, these kind of forgeries and, you know, protocols of the elders of Zion, these kind of theories that then get used in kind of globalist conspiracy theory. And I think that we're in the age we're living in seems to play into that. Of course, it's coming also from the very top in America of playing into and using and exploiting conspiracy theory and fake news and fears of the deep state for manipulative purposes. So of course, brainwashing, you know, the SOS about brainwashing can itself be a form of brainwashing.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, yeah. Let's go to the Q&A now. It's 12:30 here in Los Angeles. Please put your questions in the Q&A box. Also, in case you already formulated questions in the chat, please copy them to the Q&A box, because that is where we are looking. And the first question is from Bruce Hollihan. Do you believe in the possibility that much of what has been seen behind the Iron Curtain with regard to brainwashing and parapsychology is a blend of concepts and ideas which are partially valid, and another part which is disinformation intended to confuse Western intelligence? And then he goes on to say, I say this because I was given a copy of Ostrander and Schroeder's work about psychic discoveries behind the Iron Curtain in the mid-70s by the Rand Corporation researcher Dr. Furman Krieger. He said that when Rand started their research, their findings were positive, only to be negated by an eventual flooding of disinformation from the Soviet intelligence services.
I mean, I do think that, you know, and this goes back to my response to your question about Robert J. Lifton and that seminal book in 1961, that I think that often there is a mixture. I mean, there can be elements of truth stitched together with fantasy, but worlds of fantasy and manipulation can also coexist with you know, the articulation of genuine fears about, you know, genuine dangers. And that it becomes then very difficult for us. I mean, this is part of the crisis, I guess, going back to conspiracies. Of course, there can also be real conspiracies in the world. You know, people can plot. That doesn't, it's not that everything is necessarily fantastical. So one has to look at the elements of fantasy, people's anxieties, but also, of course, the cynical use of theories that may use elements of real doubt and seize on such fears or genuine concerns about the, you know, abuses of science, but then in this much more melodramatic, sensationalistic ways. I think it's actually interesting just to cite one other key book from that period, Milosz, the great Polish poet Milosz's book, The Captive Mind, which was written in 1953, that puts a spotlight both on Cold War Poland and on America, you know, on the West. But to think about whether people are in a state of actual total deception, totally deceived, and are totally beguiled, you know, like in that model of advertising, people completely at the mercy of the hidden persuaders, whether it's Cold War brainwashers or Madison Avenue, or whether there's some much more complex mix of knowing and not knowing, you know, where we're much more split. And Milosz was very good on that. He talked about some people taking a kind of drug under Stalinism, where they basically just gave themselves over completely to a Stalinist ideology, and other people who much more were maneuvering, playing along, performing a role of allegiance, you know, split between their secret thoughts and their public utterances. You know, so there's not one monolithic way it all works with brainwashing or totalitarianism. And probably in all of this, one's looking at very often at sort of a hybrid mix of psychological states or realities and deceptions.
Thank you. The next question is by Danny Birchall, the co-curator of the War of Nerves exhibition at the Wende Museum from the Welcome Collection. And he writes, Daniel, how much do you think that the idea or fantasy that communists would brainwash people reflected or deflected a more real fear on the part of Western governments that citizens of Western societies could become rationally convinced by radical left-wing ideas and attempt to change those societies from within?
That's a great question, and I should say hi to Danny, because we collaborated also on the great project you had at the Wende ages ago. And I think that's right. That I think that that it was a Cold War football, this idea of brainwashing. So there is also the exploitation of it and an anxiety, of course, that there might be that people might be drawn to the left. That the idea of radicalization is interesting now, because it's as though to be radical, I mean, the way that term has become synonymous with brainwashing. And of course, it's now used in relation to religious fundamentalism most often. But of course, being radical back in the 60s had a different meaning. And there was always that issue of, could you rationally choose to adopt a communist program or a socialist program? And certainly that, the idea that those 21 American GIs back at the end of the Korean War might have preferred an alternative system seemed almost unthinkable to the sort of Cold War hawks. They had to have been brainwashed. And actually, when you read what they wrote, I mean, one of them was an African American GI called Clarence Adams, who wrote a very interesting memoir that was published posthumously by his daughter. It was called An American Dream. And he wrote about his years in China in that book, and that he had every reason to choose to not go back to the Deep South in the US and hit the experiences of racism and the history of slavery, and that he chose to go. And that we were very interested. We interviewed another of those GIs, David Hawkins, for a film which you're going to show, I think, on Friday, you were saying, Battle of the Mind, where David Hawkins, who's, talks about why he went to China and why he was tempted and drawn to those ideas. So the limits of the permissible, the political spectrum of what's regarded as sane politics itself is a movable feast. What do we regard as madness, as a sane society? And that was very much debated in the Cold War, whether liberal democracy or whether the free market had to go together with, quote, the so-called free market, and whether the sane society and the sane mind were always necessarily our form of polity. I mean, it was almost like an anticipation of the end of history thesis that you get at the end of the Cold War, but back in the late 40s, that somehow this version of liberal democracy that's being enshrined is simply equivalent to sanity and normality.
Right. And we have two questions that relate to MKUltra. I will take them together. The first is, can you explain a bit on what military objectives were the primary purpose of MKUltra or other mind control programs, and what, if any, evidence of success were there? And then Andrea Ballatore writes, shouldn't the abject failure of MKUltra and mind control programs give us hope about the intrinsic limits of mind manipulation? In other words, do you think that it is exaggerated to expect Silicon Valley tech giants to succeed at manipulating us with complex but ultimately crude models of human behavior?
I mean, there are so many fascinating questions there. I can't do justice to it. Of course, one of the effects of the manipulation of data, the sort of semiotics model that was then in its more sophisticated versions the last few years, might be also to demoralize certain groups and cause people not to vote, rather than necessarily to brainwash people completely to vote one way or another, but to sort of, as it were, to disenchant and disillusion. And there is, of course, much known about the use, the cynical use of messaging and the websites and so on, and targeted messaging simply to turn people off from politics. I think with MKUltra, I mean, one can look at it as a history of failure. One can also look at the methods of enhanced interrogation more recently as a history of failure. That people, I mean, there are different schools of thought about this. I mean, about one school of thought is that not only is this panoply of techniques obviously utterly immoral because it's torture, but it's also ineffective because under duress, people will say anything. And therefore you get entirely unreliable information. So it's both, as it were, on pragmatic or utilitarian grounds, useless, as well as being evil. The other line of thought might be that it's evil, but that it can be used to break people, and that there are indeed, you know, conditions in which people will break down and confess, and that sophisticated interrogators are also skilled at sifting, as it were, the fantasies people will spin, or the anything, you know, to get off the hook from, and can also, of course, cross-refer to other interrogations. You know, and there's an important literature on Western torture, because it's not just the US and MK Ultra, it's also the story of British torture, French torture. You know, I mean, it's the horrifying history of what's been done in the name of Western liberal democracies all the way through. But I think the programs are used, you know, are developed, as I say, both, there's a kind of idea of helping people to resist. So the techniques that are then used in various forms of training, of, as it were, simulations of interrogation or imprisonment. Again, you might have a critique, which is you can never simulate the real thing, because if it's just a kind of exercise, however awful it is to be stuck in, you know, a hole in the ground, or, you know, I don't know, if you're working for the special forces, it's not the same as actually being in enemy hands. But anyway, there's that notion of preparedness that develops, that Hunter and others are certainly proselytizing for in the original literature on brainwashing. There's the use of expertise in propaganda campaigns, counterinsurgencies, in you know, re-education models that combine old-fashioned physical brutality and torture with these new techniques of sensory deprivation and the rest. And, you know, so I think that others would know much more than me about, you know, the actual balance sheet on, as it were, military success and failure in the various counterinsurgencies of the Cold War. But I take the point that they may be also extremely ineffectual in their sort of idealized versions of what you can do.
Right. So we're almost running out of time, but I would like to end with two questions. The first is by Susanne Altman, who was the curator of the exhibition, The Media Insurrection, which was shown in the Albertinum in Dresden and then at the Wende Museum. And she writes, I always wondered about the mindset of German communists that sought political asylum from Nazi persecution in the Soviet Union and found themselves in the middle of Stalin's purges. So many were sent to the gulags, many were executed, and still many of those who survived came back to Eastern Germany and represented fiercely the idea of communism, even with restrictive measurements. Is their mindset caused by brainwashing in the Soviet Union, like deleting what happened to them and being convinced still they were on the right side of history?
I mean, that's, again, such a huge and important question. I mean, there's the one question about people who cross over, who are taken, whether it's to the West or the Soviet Union from Nazi Germany. But the question of conviction or changed belief that might be an authentic, as it were, conversion freely, as opposed to a kind of coerced confessional state of mind, also takes us back to the show trials of the late 30s that backshadows the literature on brainwashing, and these extraordinary confessions, you know, that that are made, you know, in the late 30s, where people sign their own death warrants and confess to treason, confess to being Trotskyists when actually they're Stalinists, but as it were, in the name of the revolution, sacrifice themselves, even write these, you know, heartbreaking letters to Stalin, you know, sort of, as it were, offering themselves up as sort of sacrificial lambs in the name of the revolution. Is that, you know, what's coerced and what's, as it were, true, as it were, authentic, if crazy belief? That leads to a kind of a huge kind of range of speculations about the show trials that then gets revived in the 40s with those post-war confessions of Cardinal Mindszenty, was the famous one in Budapest, who confesses to crimes. There are American businessmen like Robert Vogler. You know, this question of what do we make of confession and conversion, free or coerced? What, you know, I think that's again part of this bigger story.
Right. So I want to finish with three questions actually that more or less amount to the same point. Jerry Ferris writes, self-inflicted brainwashing. What a great line. Now, how does one reach such people with actual truth? And Natasha Gascon writes, what can we do to reverse this horrible trend of self-brainwashing? And then there is Ray Cunningham who writes, how to counter and overcome this brainwashing or phenomenon in our times? So I think that's a very fitting final question for this interview.
Yes, it's interesting, the idea that you could brainwash yourself as opposed to persuade yourself or be in a state. I've recently co-edited with the historian Catherine Hall a series of pieces about the state of denial, which is another interesting concept, which comes from Freud, of ideas of denial and disavowal, which could be, as it were, going on intrapsychically in our own minds. It's interesting whether we need, as it were, other terms than brainwashing for what's being called their self-brainwashing. But the interplay between what we do to our own minds, how much we want to face truth, to, as it were, struggle with the difficulty of things, and how much we, as it were, allow ourselves to as it were, go along with forms of coercive persuasion. What's intrapsychic and what's interpersonal is interesting. I mean, I'm reminded of Trump in 2016 offering himself to his base as I am your voice. So what is the, as it were, the chemistry there? What is the, as it were, the psychological language we would need to explain the interplay between the audience and the speaker, between, as it were, this form of populist politics and, quote, the mass, but also the kinds of self-deception in the neoliberalism that many people signed up to, not just in the populism that was a reaction to the neoliberalism. One needs to think then of what kinds of delusion became so commonplace for many people, that was a kind of is it brainwashing? Is it intrapsychic hidden persuasion? Is it coming from outside ideologically? I think this crisis of democracy and freedom, it feels very acute at the moment. We can see it in the US election, where even as we speak, it's being discredited by Trump, the outcome, the extraordinary phenomenon of, the continuing support, whatever Trump says. I think the conspiracy theory is part of what needs to be tackled. There was an important project in Cambridge, people can Google, that was on conspiracy and democracy a couple of years ago with reports. So I think there's a great deal of work to do. I don't have any magic answer, but it's
in one sentence.
History is part of our current crisis that we need to think about. And I think all of that post-war literature merits rereading. Milosz and Lifton and Hannah Arendt and all the rest of it. And I hope people will look at some of the blogs and films we've amassed on hidden persuaders. But there's a whole range of work going on. I think we're just part of a bigger network of academic research that hopefully can be of some use, so that we're not just reinventing the wheel.
Fantastic. Daniel Pick, thank you so much for your insights and your incredible knowledge. It was a great pleasure to have you in this series.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me, and thanks for all the interesting questions.
Sure, and I apologize again for not being able to answer all the questions. Next week, I'll speak with Joanna Stingray about her experiences as an American rock star in the Moscow music underground scene in the 1980s, under the title Connecting Space, Rock Music Between East and West. And also I want to mention that in 2 weeks from now, once we will move Cold War Spaces to the Thursday instead of Wednesday, same time. My guest will be Alex Vitali, the author of The End of Policing, and that will be an interesting discussion as well. So I hope to see you there, and have a wonderful week, everyone.